At 84 years old, Paul Anka has seen it all: fame, fortune, heartbreak, and history. But now, in the twilight of his legendary career, he's finally revealing the one chapter he kept sealed for decades: his complicated, emotional, and at times terrifying relationship with Frank Sinatra. For years, Anka called Sinatra a friend, a mentor, even a brother. But behind the glitz and glamour was something darker, an undercurrent of control, silence, and unspoken fear. In a new interview, Anka doesn't just honor the legend, he dismantles it. What he witnessed inside Sinatra's circle, what he was asked to do, and what he refused to become, it changes everything. This isn't just a tribute, it's a confession. And it's the story Paul Anka swore he'd never tell, until now. Before he was a household name, Paul Anka was just a teenager from Ottawa, with a pencil, a piano, and a dream louder than anyone around him could understand. At 15, he wrote Diana, a heartbreak anthem that shot him into the spotlight overnight. He wasn't just a performer, he was a songwriter, a self-made force with a voice beyond his years. By 18, he had written hits for other stars, toured the world, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the biggest acts of the 1950s. But it was one song, one timeless anthem, that would define both his career and another man's legacy forever. That song was My Way. Anka didn't write it for himself. He adapted it from a French tune, poured English lyrics into it, and crafted it specifically for Frank Sinatra, a man he both idolized and feared. He wrote it late one night in New York City, alone in his hotel room, the words falling out of him like a eulogy for a man still alive. When he presented it to Sinatra, Frank didn't just like it. He claimed it, owned it, lived it. It became his signature, his send-off, his legend. And Paul Anka? He watched it happen. He watched My Way climb to mythical status, a song blasted at funerals, played during final acts, and quoted by presidents. Everyone knew Sinatra's voice. Few knew Paul Anka's pen had created it. And even fewer knew what that moment cost him. Because that song was more than music. It was a passport into Sinatra's world. Anka became the kid among giants. He wasn't officially part of the Rat Pack, but he was close enough to feel the heat. He saw it all: the champagne, the after-hours clubs, the quiet deals, the backstage whispers. He learned quickly that admiration came with conditions, and loyalty was never optional. From the outside, it looked like Anka was living the dream. But from the inside, he was watching a myth in motion, knowing full well he'd given Sinatra the final soundtrack to his legend. And in doing so, stepped into a world where nothing, not even a hit song, came without a price. Being close to Frank Sinatra wasn't just about glamorous parties and standing ovations. It was about surviving a world that operated by its own brutal set of rules. For Paul Anka, stepping into Sinatra's orbit was like stepping into a high-stakes poker game where the chips weren't just money. They were reputation, access, and control. Sinatra didn't simply invite you into his circle. He allowed it, and that allowance came with invisible strings no one dared pull. The Rat Pack wasn't just a group of entertainers. It was a machine. And Sinatra sat at the top like a king whose approval could launch careers or end them. Paul Anka, still young and wide-eyed, quickly learned the hierarchy. Sammy Davis Jr. brought the soul. Dean Martin brought the swagger. And Frank? He brought the silence. The kind that could chill a room and shut down conversations with a single glare. Anka has said in recent years that the power Sinatra held wasn't just artistic, it was political. "You didn't cross Frank," he said plainly. You didn't tell him no. You played the game or you disappeared. He tells stories now, carefully with deliberate pauses, about nights in Vegas where men with no official titles gave instructions, about phone calls that came from associates before a big show, about moments when even Frank seemed nervous, because some of the people around him weren't just fans or promoters. They were something else entirely. There was a weight to being inside Sinatra's circle, a price for proximity. Paul knew that every joke told, every deal made, every song sung on stage came with eyes watching from the shadows. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. And yet, through all of it, Paul played along. He smiled, he shook hands, he wrote songs, because to defy Sinatra wasn't just career suicide, it was dangerous. Frank's world ran on loyalty, and the cost of betrayal wasn't measured in headlines. It was measured in silence, in doors closed forever, in favors reversed. Anka was in the room. He heard the whispers, he saw the deals, but he also knew how to survive. Stay useful, stay respectful, and above all, stay quiet. There was one night Paul Anka has never been able to shake. It didn't happen on a stage or at a lavish Rat Pack gathering. It happened behind closed doors, in a Las Vegas dressing room that smelled like sweat, cigarettes, and stale tension. He was in his 20s, still riding the high of success, still basking in the glow of being the kid who wrote my way. But that night, the glow faded, and the man he thought was his hero revealed just how cold the spotlight could be. Anka had shown up early, eager, maybe too eager. He'd brought new arrangements, he had ideas, he wanted to impress. But as he stepped into the room, Sinatra was already there, seated in silence, surrounded by two men in suits and a bottle of Jack that was already half gone. Paul offered a handshake. Frank didn't look up. Then came the words, sharp, dismissive, and delivered with the kind of disdain only Sinatra could lace into a whisper. Don't forget who made that song matter, kid. It cut deeper than Anka expected. He wasn't just being put in his place. He was being reminded that no matter how talented he was, no matter how successful he became, he would never outrank the icon in the room. To Sinatra, my way belonged to him. The world agreed. And Paul? He was just the kid who got lucky. Anka said nothing. He stood there, stunned, humiliated. He thought about firing back, but he knew better. He nodded, smiled faintly, and stepped away. That night, he performed like nothing happened, but something inside him cracked. That encounter didn't end their relationship, but it forever changed it. It was the moment Paul stopped being a fan. It was the night he understood that in Sinatra's world, gratitude was a currency that ran dry fast. Respect had a shelf life, and love was transactional. Years later, Anka would describe that night not as a betrayal, but as a turning point. It was when I realized I was in the presence of greatness, he said, but also in the presence of danger. Frank could love you on Monday and forget you on Tuesday. That night didn't break Paul. It taught him how to stand alone. Because after that, he never looked at Frank or fame the same way again. For years, the whispers followed Paul Anka like smoke, quiet, persistent, always trailing just behind him. Whispers about who Frank Sinatra was really connected to, about how business was handled behind closed doors, and about the invisible lines you didn't cross if you wanted to stay in the game. And Anka, always observant, always careful, saw more than he let on. Especially the night a contract appeared that he still remembers in perfect detail. It was during the early 70s, in a penthouse suite after a show in Chicago. The party had quieted down, and Paul was ushered into a side room with 3 men. One of them was a lawyer, though no one introduced him that way. The other 2 were simply friends of the family. They smiled. They poured drinks. Then they slid a piece of paper across the table. It wasn't a record deal. It wasn't a publishing agreement. It was something else, vague, open-ended, and written in language that didn't need to be explained. An understanding, they called it. The gist was clear. Paul would be part of a select network. He'd receive protection, access, favors. In return, certain gigs would be strongly encouraged. Certain payments wouldn't go through labels, and certain names wouldn't be questioned. Paul froze. He wasn't naive. He knew what he was looking at. He knew what it meant to sign, and what it meant to refuse. One of the men said casually, "Frank thinks this would be good for you. Wouldn't want to disappoint him." Another added, "You sign this, your family." But Paul Anka didn't sign. He smiled, thanked them, said he needed to run it by his own lawyer. He left the room with his pulse racing and didn't return to the party. The next few weeks were tense. A few calls went unanswered. A show he was scheduled to headline got mysteriously canceled. And then it passed. The pressure faded. The paper was never brought up again. But the memory stayed. To this day, Anka believes Sinatra never sent those men, but also never stopped them. That's how it worked, Paul later said. He didn't give orders. Things just happened. He survived because he was smart, because he never challenged the system. He sidestepped it, because he understood that in the world Sinatra ruled, saying no didn't always make you a target. Sometimes it just made you invisible. And Paul Anka was determined to stay visible, on his own terms, with his own name. My Way was the crown jewel of Paul Anka's songwriting career, and the crown that Frank Sinatra wore until the very end. It's one of the most iconic songs in history, a powerful anthem of defiance, reflection, and pride. But what most people don't know is that the man who wrote it rarely performed it himself. Not because he didn't love it, but because, for decades, it wasn't truly his anymore. Anka adapted the lyrics from a French ballad, poured his own soul into them, and crafted a song tailor-made for Sinatra's voice and persona. It was personal, poetic, and fearless. And when Frank sang it, it exploded. The song became his story. He performed it like it was carved from his own bones. To the world, My Way was Sinatra's autobiography. Paul Anka's name was in the credits, but lost in the roar of the legend. For years, Paul let it be. Out of respect, out of fear, out of complicated loyalty. It was like giving birth to something and watching someone else raise it, he once said. He avoided singing it live. He never tried to reclaim it. The song lived in Sinatra's shadow, and so did Paul's authorship of it. But the silence came at a cost. Every time My Way played at a funeral, graduation, or farewell, Anka felt a strange mix of pride and pain. It wasn't bitterness, it was distance. He had written something timeless, and yet he wasn't allowed to own it emotionally. The world didn't associate My Way with the quiet Canadian kid who wrote it in a hotel room. They associated it with the voice that roared from stages, the man who lived large, and the myth that overshadowed the melody. After Sinatra's death in 1998, Paul remained quiet. He didn't do a victory lap. He didn't reclaim the song. Instead, he mourned. And then, slowly, something changed. He began performing My Way again, this time with different eyes. He told the story behind it. He explained the heart that went into it. And in doing so, he slowly peeled the legend away from the lyrics. Now, in his 80s, Paul Anka sings My Way not as a tribute, but as a testimony. Not as Sinatra's anthem, but as a reminder that behind every icon, there's a songwriter who made it possible. Behind the stage lights and tuxedos, Paul Anka witnessed a side of Frank Sinatra that few dared to speak about, especially when it came to the women. To the world, Sinatra was a ladies' man, charming, romantic, magnetic. But to those inside his circle, there was another layer, one far less glamorous, and often deeply uncomfortable. And for a young Anka navigating that world, learning the unspoken rules became a matter of survival. There were rules, Anka said in a recent interview. You didn't flirt with the wrong woman. You didn't look too long. And you never, ever questioned who she came with. The message was clear. When Sinatra arrived with a woman, whether it was a Hollywood actress, a cocktail waitress, or someone less known, she was off limits, completely. Violating that rule, even accidentally, could end a friendship, a career, or worse. Anka tells stories now of lavish penthouse parties where women came and went under watchful eyes. Of girlfriends Sinatra kept close, sometimes for months, sometimes for nights. Of sudden disappearances. One night in Palm Springs, a young starlet was escorted out mid-party by two of Sinatra's men after laughing too loudly at another man's joke. She wasn't seen again in that circle. The tension was real. The power dynamics were crystal clear. And Paul, still young and ambitious, learned to smile, nod, and walk away. He admits there were times he wanted to speak up, times he felt something wasn't right. But in that world, silence wasn't cowardice. It was strategy. You didn't confront Frank, he said. You distanced yourself, quietly, carefully. He also saw how other men followed Sinatra's lead, adopting the same possessive attitude, mimicking his dominance, believing that power excused behavior. It was a culture that ran deep, protected by fame and insulated by fear. Now, at 84, Paul looks back with clarity. He doesn't try to cancel or condemn, but he doesn't sugarcoat either. He acknowledges the darkness behind the charisma, the pressure behind the glitz, and the women who became props in a kingdom built on charm and control. He stayed quiet back then, because speaking out meant exile. But now, he's ready to say what everyone else was too afraid to. For decades, Paul Anka was the loyal gentleman of showbiz, well-dressed, well-spoken, and famously tight-lipped. When people asked about Sinatra, he smiled. When pressed about the Rat Pack, he deflected with charm. But behind that polished exterior was a man carrying a weight he never fully unpacked. A weight that came from staying silent in a world that demanded compliance. So why didn't he speak sooner? Because back then, Anka said, you didn't survive by telling the truth. You survived by protecting it. The truth was complicated. Frank Sinatra was his hero, his mentor, the man who gave his song life. But he was also volatile, controlling, and surrounded by people who didn't take kindly to criticism, especially from someone they saw as the kid in the room. Paul knew that airing grievances could turn dangerous, maybe not physically, but professionally. And for someone like Anka, who'd worked his way to the top from nothing, the risk wasn't worth it. He had a family to protect, a career to preserve, and an audience to entertain. Nobody wanted the kid with the pen to make waves, he said. They just wanted me to keep writing songs. So he stayed in the background, even as he watched the machine protect itself. He witnessed the rewriting of legacies in real time. He watched men get elevated while others, some just as talented, disappeared. He saw silence rewarded and truth punished. But time does something strange. It loosens the grip of fear. It sharpens memory. And eventually, it makes you ask, what was I protecting? Anka reached that crossroads in his 80s. With most of the old guard gone and nothing left to lose, he decided to stop holding back. This isn't revenge, he clarified. It's release. For the first time, he's telling the full story. Not just the headlines and handshakes, but the tension, the manipulation, and the moments when the price of fame almost outweighed its benefits. Paul Anka doesn't want sympathy. He doesn't want applause. He wants the truth to exist. Because legends are often built on silence, and at 84, he's done being quiet. At 84, Paul Anka isn't seeking redemption. He isn't looking for headlines or rewriting his past to fit a trend. What he's doing now is far more powerful. He's reclaiming his truth. After a lifetime in the shadow of Frank Sinatra's legend, Anka has finally stepped into the light with a voice not of rebellion, but of reflection. His words aren't bitter, they're clear, and for the first time, they're his. He's no longer the teenager trying to impress the Rat Pack. He's no longer the songwriter watching his anthem get claimed by another man. He's the survivor, the observer who lived through the golden age of show business without being swallowed by it. And now, his legacy is being redefined, not just as the man behind my way, but as the man who finally found his way. What Paul Anka reveals in these later years peels back decades of myth-making. Sinatra will always be a towering figure in American music, but Anka is reminding the world that even legends cast shadows, and someone has to live in them. For too long, the story of My Way and Anka's role in it was a footnote. For too long, the nuances of their relationship, the closeness, the control, the reverence, and the fear, were buried under nostalgia and old Hollywood glamour. But now, Paul Anka is writing the final verse. And this time, it's not for someone else to sing. He's performing My Way with a different energy, less a tribute, more a declaration. Each lyric now drips with layered meaning, as if he's not just telling Sinatra's story anymore, but his own. And as the spotlight dims and his voice carries through theaters packed with fans who now know the truth, one thing becomes clear. Paul Anka never needed to borrow greatness. He had it all along. Now, as his words echo louder than ever, he's not just closing the book on his past with Frank Sinatra. He's finally authoring the ending himself. And it ends not in whispers, but with a voice that stood silent for too long, singing the truth his way. As Paul Anka steps into the final chapter of his remarkable life, he's no longer the kid in Sinatra's shadow. He's the man who outlasted the legend. At 84, he's done seeking approval, done staying silent, and done letting others define his legacy. By finally telling the truth about the power, the pain, the silence, and the song, he's given the world something Sinatra never could: perspective. My Way may have made Frank famous, but it was Paul's pen that gave it life. Now, after decades of loyalty and restraint, Anka has reclaimed that legacy, not with revenge, but with truth. And in doing so, he's proven that sometimes the most powerful voice isn't the one that roars. It's the one that waits, that watches, that finally, when the time is right, sings its truth with no fear. Paul Anka didn't just survive the golden age, he wrote its soundtrack. And now, at long last, the final note belongs to him.